Hey folks, this is Chapter 9's lecture. You're watching this video because I was summoned to jury duty and I ended up having to be there most of the day. Stay tuned for some updates about whether I will have to continue to go or actually be with you in class like normal. Either way, we'll find some way for class to be covered and to finish out these last couple of weeks of the semester. I'm trying a couple of new things today. I've never recorded using Zoom's PowerPoint screen share as well as the webcam overlaid on top of that. And I've also never used this headset to record. I'm hoping it will help with ambient noise, like with the air conditioner running and my husband just generally living in the apartment. So I'm recording from home today. I'm also going to try to make this a few different videos to really cater to our shorter attention spans these days, especially when we're using digital devices, and also to just help break up these concepts so that you can study one on its own and repeat or refresh as needed. So we're going to start by talking about the Sapir Worf hypothesis, and your textbook doesn't use that nomenclature to talk about it, I don't think, but we will talk about the terms that your textbook does use and how that lines up with how some other folks in the linguistics world talk about this issue. It's kind of an ongoing debate in the realm of cognitive psychology and linguistics. We also have, we're going to talk about what is a language anyway, after we talk about kind of different languages. We think we know what language is, but how does it differ from animal communication, for example? We'll talk just a smidge about typical language development in children, and then we're going to talk some about the relationship between language and our general intelligence. So we'll start with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and that will be the case for only this chunk of the video, and each little chunk in this overview will get its own short video. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a way of talking about how language might be a cognitive filter for us. It helps to ask the question, does which language we're speaking change the way that we do any of the rest of our cognitive processing, all the stuff we talked about before and some of the stuff we're going to talk about in future chapters. So there are three different terms we can use for this, and I'm going to show some other ways of talking about it as well. One of these I created myself because I don't think it really has a term, but from now on you'll know what I'm talking about when I say all three of these. But I do want to point out that every time I've asked people to write essay questions about this topic, there's always a few people who misunderstand the question. When I ask whether language affects our other cognitive processing, I don't mean having language versus not having language, like in the case of people who are nonverbal or non-human animals that don't use language. I'm talking about which language you're speaking. I'm asking whether your native language fundamentally changes, like learning that at a young age fundamentally changed the rest of your cognition. So in the center of the most extreme form of this viewpoint, we have what's called linguistic determinism. This means that your language, your native language, determines the way that you think. A weaker version of this is called linguistic relativity. That means there may be some advantages or some disadvantages that your native language gives you in terms of your other cognitive processes. But you could overcome those if you learned a different language and thought in that mindset. And then we have what I call cognitive linguistic independence, which means that neither of those are true and that we have these cognitive universals. We all have the same basic makeup no matter what language we are speaking. So the first one, just another way of representing these three concepts to give a little more detail. The first one we call the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Again, it's called linguistic determinism. It's the most extreme form of this hypothesis, and it states that our language controls our cognition. The weak Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that linguistic relativity that's somewhere in the middle, that says maybe your native language can give you some advantages, and maybe sometimes it's a little bit of a disadvantage, but overall it's not a big deal. And we also call that language assisting cognition. So in your textbook, this is broken down under little orange headers of language controls cognition. Does language assist cognition? That's where you're going to find this evidence. And then our third position that I call cognitive linguistic independence says no version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is true, and that your native language does not affect your cognition. We have the same fundamental human mind. The different languages that we speak are just different flavors of doing the same thing, and they don't really affect the way we process information. So we're going to start looking in more detail at the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, our linguistic determinism. Predictions are that if you have the same number of words across two different languages for the same concept, then the speakers of those two languages will have the same understanding of the concept. So what do you mean the same number of words or different number of words? I mean, in English, when we say please, in Spanish, they accomplish the same thing with two words, saying por favor, right? So sometimes we use a smaller or larger amount of words to get the same idea across. Sometimes we don't even have the idea in one language and we borrow from another, like déjà vu. Linguistic determinism predicts that in those cases where we have a different number of words for the same concept, those people are understanding the concept in a fundamentally different way based on which of the languages they're speaking. The research findings, the original findings behind this kind of old school hypothesis were observations of Inuit words for snow. It was said that they had dozens and dozens of words for snow, and that's because they fundamentally understood the concept of snow in a very different way from languages with fewer words for snow. However, more recent findings have shown that that was a little bit of a misunderstanding because the people who originally studied this weren't linguists. They were just fascinated by the topic, but they were amateurs. So more recent findings by actual linguists who have really broken down the Inuit language have found that that language is agglutinating, which means that it's sort of like German does this. So let's follow me for a second. It just means that you can smush the adjective together with a word and easily make a lot of compound words. So you smush the adjective together with a noun. So instead of like brown dog, it would be brown dog as a single word. Okay. So imagine that for all the words for snow, like light or fluffy or deep or, you know, really frozen. I don't know a lot of things about snow, and y'all probably don't either, right? We're Southern. But there's a lot of different ways of describing snow, apparently, a lot of different types. So in the Inuit language, they don't actually have more words for it than we do in English. They just smush the adjective together with the noun. And so it seems like there's a bunch of unique words. So the original work behind this didn't really hold up when it was looked at more closely by linguists. So the verdict on this theory is that it's not strongly supported, it's a little too extreme, and the implications seem a little racist. It's very tied up with race science and eugenics and the history of science, and that's not something we're very comfortable with anymore. The idea that your language fundamentally shapes the way that you see the world really divides us a lot more, and we don't really want to think about the fact that people from different cultures may be fundamentally unable to completely understand each other. So in the early 20th century, this theory was very popular. Nowadays, not so much. We don't like to think about different cultures that way. So we have a weaker one. Remember, linguistic relativity. Let's take a deeper dive into that one. Linguistic relativity has its own predictions, namely that, you know, speaking a different native language can somewhat affect other cognitive skills, but those skills can be gained if you speak that language. So if speaking Chinese gives some kind of cognitive advantage, I'm not totally screwed as a native English speaker. I could learn Chinese and get those same skills if I wanted to. So linguistic relativity states that there's smaller differences and that I'm not permanently cognitively wired by my native language. If you removed the advantage of my language, maybe my cognition and my ability to process information is actually kind of the same as everyone else's. And there are studies to support this. In your textbook, there's a few of these described. One of them hinges on the fact that in Russian, there are two different words for blue. Children are taught this, and everyone grows up understanding that these are two distinct colors, not just blue. There's not a word for just blue. These are completely distinct colors. Like a couple of the blues on this slide, the first one and the second one might be put into completely different color categories. I think, I don't know my Russian blues, but that's how the concept works. So when you give native Russian speakers a whole bunch of paint swatches, like the little chips from Home Depot, and there's just a hundred, dozens and dozens and hundreds of shades of blue, and you ask them to categorize, like, is this X or Y, those Russian words for the two blues, they just categorize them with great ease into the two categories. They don't have a problem with it. It's just like if I asked you, take these paint swatches and put them in blue or green. There's some bluish green colors, but you can decide this one's more of a bluish blue-green or a greenish blue-green, and you can still put them in a category pretty reliably, and other English speakers would do the same thing. If you compare, so if you take English speakers, train them to recognize these two blues that they have in Russian, and ask us to categorize those same paint swatches, we can do it once we're trained to see what the two blues are, but we're slower at it and we're going to make more errors. It just makes sense. We haven't grown up, speaking, for decades with these concepts. But so this doesn't actually tell us which version of the Sapir Worf hypothesis this supports yet. It could just be like, okay, Russian speakers are just like permanently and naturally like better at seeing these two blues, and the rest of us can't even, like, we don't see blue the same way. So in order to test it further, whether the advantage is from the language or whether the advantage is just like a cognitive advantage of seeing blue differently, which is what linguistic determinism might say, they just see blue better now. Linguistic relativity says, maybe the advantage is just their language, so let's try taking that away and see what happens. How do you take away somebody's language ethically? So what we would do is just ask these Russian and English speakers, we'll have our control group do the same thing, we'll just ask them to do some task that uses their phonological loop while they're categorizing these blues. Because remember, each one of your pieces of working memory is can only do one task at a time. So if we make you repeat something like shadow a message and overload your phonological loop can no longer access your linguistic terms, those words for the two blues. For an English speaker, not a huge deal. You've only just learned the words, they weren't helping you much anyway. But as a Russian speaker, we then remove the advantage of your language. You're not able to use your two words for these two blues anymore because your phonological loop is busy doing something else, this task of shadowing a message, for example. And you will perform just the same as the native English speakers. Similarly, there can be math boosts across certain languages. And this is another one your textbook talks about. English is a very unintuitive counting system in the teens especially. And I'm sure you've noticed this at some point. So we get to 10, and then 11 and 12 are especially weird. They don't relate to any of the other number words. Then we skip 13, 14, 15. Okay, those start to make sense. It means like 10 and 3, 10 and 4, 10 and 5. But 11 and 12 are just, they're just an extra word you have to memorize. They don't have any clues in them as to what the number actually is, how you get to that number. And they actually don't follow a system of the rest of the numbers. So they're really puzzling to non-native speakers and to small children who are learning to count for the first time. It's not obvious to them what 11 and 12 are. It's just another word they have to learn. So when you start getting them to do math with numbers like 11 and 12, they're kind of slow to learn it. In many other languages, however, there's a very regular system. So the reason that 11 and 12 are so weird is that they've been, I mean, English is really mixed together from a lot of different languages historically, and some of our words have our old Germanic roots. It's like comes from Old Norse and stuff like that. Old English was really a Germanic language, but then about 1,000 years ago, we got an infusion of French that changed a lot of our vocabulary. So some of the structure of our language is still Germanic, and then we have a very Latin Romance influence from French that really mixes things up. So that's why English is so illogical, because it's a mash of a couple of different systems that didn't really fit well together in the first place, and there's no rhyme or reason as to when we use old Germanic parts of English or when we use newer French parts of English. So that's why our numbers are so messed up. Other languages didn't really have this historical problem, many of them, so they might have been purely a Latin-based, Romance language for a long time, and then they were unaffected by this sort of problem. Or they might have been isolated from other languages for a different reason and kept a really strong cultural identity over time. So if we think of Mandarin Chinese, for example, a lot of the languages in Southeast Asia in this area weren't mixed with radically different languages because of some geographical boundaries for a very, very long time, and because of a strong political structure. So Mandarin has a very logical counting system. You have words that you have to memorize as a kid for 1 through 10, but then when you get to 11, it just literally means 10 and 1, 10 and 2, 10 and 3, 10 and 4. So 11 and 12 are just as logical as the teens. So when you start doing math, when you're like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, when you first start doing math to add up to 11 or subtract something from 11, you are so much faster at it because you know what the number actually means. There's clues in the word that tell you what numbers make up that number. And Mandarin isn't by far the only language to logically count like this. There are many, many others on the earth. English is just a very weird one. So speakers of Mandarin and of Japanese and of other logical counting languages early on are better at math than their English-speaking peers. Yeah, you get a math boost from speaking Chinese. So might be a good idea to, I don't know, put your toddlers in a Mandarin immersion class if that's around you, right? Yeah, but these differences in the long run maybe aren't that big a deal. Like, we can learn what 11 and 12 mean after a while. It's just maybe by the time that we do, the fact that our cognition has caught up to our weird number system, we might already be like slightly behind in terms of our math understanding. But most of us function just fine with our math anyway, right? So the verdict for linguistic relativity is that this theory is very supported. There's quite a lot to suggest this one, because the advantage comes from the language. It's not just hardwired into your brain. It's something we can get around if we teach you another language. That fits with our predictions. So I'd say it's very supported and that this middle ground is pretty likely. But let's also look at the evidence for independence. Cognitive linguistic independence is when we say that your native language doesn't affect your cognition at all. We all basically have the same cognition. This cognitive linguistic independence predicts that cognitive universals persist across cultures, and that your native language does not shape any of your other information processing steps. There's a few different findings to support this one as well. These were mostly, back in the day, arguing against that original strongest linguistic determinism. So they weren't looking for a middle ground at the time. They wanted to show that linguistic determinism was too extreme and that it was wrong. So some of these experiments did show that. Remember that linguistic determinism says that if we have the same number of words for a concept, even across different languages, we understand the concept in the same way. Well, children and adults use the same numbers of words for the same concepts, but they're using them differently sometimes. And it took me a while to wrap my head around the mistakes that kids were making in the examples in your textbook. So your textbook has an example of a tree with apples on it, and there's two pictures of the tree. There's one that's photoshopped to have a bunch of apples, and there's one where some of the apples are erased and there's only like a few. And you can ask little kids who are like 2 or 3, which tree has more apples? And they'll point to the tree with more apples. And then if you ask which tree has fewer apples, they still point to the tree with the more apples. They were using few to mean some of something like what your book said. I didn't get it. This other example I'm about to tell you explains how I came to understand this few thing. Maybe it'll make a little more sense. Maybe y'all got it right away. I didn't. So there was one linguist who was running a bath for his 4-year-old daughter, and she said, "Daddy, make it warmer." So he checked the temperature of the water, and it already felt hot to him, like almost too hot. And he realized she did not, and kids are usually more sensitive to this, right? You touch the bath and you think it's fine, and you're like, "Oh, it burned my feet," right? So this little girl said, "Make the bath warmer." Adults would use the word warmer to mean increase the temperature. This small child seemed to be using the word warm to mean bring the temperature closer to what I consider warm, which would actually be cooler than what it is right now. So she thinks warm is somewhere in the middle, right? Not really hot. She wants the temperature to come closer to what she calls warm. So it would actually bring the temperature down. She's using the word in a way that sounds opposite from the way adults do. And these little kids pointing at the apple trees were doing the same thing when they said, you often hear, people use the word a few to mean some of something. You have a few, you might have 3. But we say fewer to mean less of something. We're taking stuff away. 2 and 3-year-olds don't understand subtraction yet. They don't really get that until like 4, 5, 6, when they're learning it in school. So when they say a few of something, I mean, if a few meant like 3 or 4, and you had fewer, wouldn't it be like a few more fews and be like, 6 or 8 or something? So when you say which tree has fewer apples and they point at the one that has more, they're just using the word few opposite of we are and saying, what's the one that has a bunch of fews? A few here and a few there and a few there. And they point at the tree with more apples. Mind blown, right? Who knew that kids were using the same words vastly differently? So that already kind of blows the Sapir Worf hypothesis out of the water, the strong one anyway. Remember, the theory also predicts that if we have a different number of words for a concept, we don't understand the concept in the same way. That's the opposite prediction. This one's also been destroyed. There's been these studies of focal colors across languages because linguists notice there are many languages across the earth that have a different number of words to describe different colors. We have, I think, 11 that are in common use that most children learn. And some languages have around 8. That's a very common set of them. So think of like your 8 most basic Crayola crayon set, and those would be maybe the words that most languages have words for in terms of colors. And then you have some extreme examples of languages that only have a handful of colors. Blue is not very common. That's not in the list of a lot of languages' colors. So you will often have just maybe like black, white, green, red, like stuff that's in nature a lot. And then you have very extreme examples where people only have words that mean like black or dark, white or light, and then sometimes red, sometimes not. It's not in all the languages. And I guess red might stick out. You might need a word for that because of blood. But a lot of other stuff, maybe you could get by with just light or dark. So anyway, researchers wondered, if the Sapir Worf hypothesis is true, maybe These people only have 3 color words because they have a form of color blindness and they see color differently than the rest of us. It's pretty easy to test that, no matter what words they're using for it. Kind of like with our Russian study, we get a bunch of paint chips from Home Depot again, and we give them to folks who speak a language with, 11 or 8 or whatever color words, and we have matching paint chips. So I'll give you a set of paint chips in front of you on your desk, and then for each of those individual colors that you have, and they'll be really specific, like taupe and chartreuse and vermilion, and like not just your basic Crayola colors, okay? And then I'll have a copy of each of those colors over here in another room in the lab, or across the room, maybe on the wall in the laboratory. And then I would ask you, just go match it. Go match each piece that you have to its match, which is not hard for most people to do. And it's actually not hard for anybody who speaks any language to do. Even these folks with only 3 color terms, 2 color terms, few to no color words, they can match these up the same as you or me. So they're perceiving color in the same way. They can see all these differences between them. They just don't need a name for all those differences. Not really a huge deal. So their native language is not affecting how they see the colors at all. It's not giving them any advantage or disadvantage in matching these paint chips. Now, this one is a bit historical, as I noted. It's also a little too extreme because this came along before some of that research I told you about, like with the Mandarin Math Boost and with the Russian Blues. So maybe it's a little too extreme, and maybe it undersells the role of our cultures contributing to our differences. We want to be somewhere in the middle because everything kind of is with this nature and nurture. So Sapir Worf hypothesis would say maybe it's a genetic thing, like you see the world differently, and so your language probably developed around seeing the world differently or whatever. This cognitive linguistic independence is kind of like you're a blank slate and it's all culture. It's really somewhere in the middle. We're going to have a little bit of both. We're going to be wired some ways, and our language can influence that, but we can always change that. Like if your language gave you a math disadvantage, you could always study more at math than your peers and overcome that difference. On our next little snippet, we're going to be looking at what is a language and how is it different from animal communication. We'll be back in just a moment.